Off the Wall Productions is proud to present Voices of the Methow. This is a series of conversations with interesting folk in and around the valley. On April 30th, 2020, Tracy Sprower, Executive Director of Methow at Home, hosted Jim Archambeault, or Arch as he's better known, telling a couple funny stories on a Zoom call. Let's listen in.
Have you ever been asked to fill in for a coworker doing some less than desirable job, which sounded like it might be fun, but turned into a nightmare? I have, unfortunately. About 35 years ago, while I was working for the Forest Service, I was asked to don the ubiquitous Smokey Bear suit and pay a visit to a class of preschoolers. This task usually fell on the shoulders of somebody working in fire prevention or one of the engine crew. For some reason, though, they were all busy or hiding out somewhere. I'm a big guy, and it does take a pretty large person to fill the Smokey suit, so an offer was made. Please, we really need someone, anyone. And I accepted graciously. Oh, hell, okay. As I now recall, it was in the late summer, early fall. It must have been the start of the school year. It was very warm, probably in the high 80s. I had never played Smokey before, but had seen people getting into the furry costume. It's a more complicated lash-up than you might know. You wear fuzzy boots, huge denim overalls, a large padded torso that's worn over a cage to make you appear to have an 80-inch chest, and a large belly. And to top it all off, a head with a classic flat-brim campaign hat, all trimmed with more furry pieces to make it blend into the chest cage. The plastic head is the most involved part of the suit. It takes a helper to get into it, and once you have it on, you are stuck in it and until you're assisted out of it. One looks out of the eyes with about a 5-degree cone of vision. There's no peripheral vision up, down, nor sideways. And because Smokey never speaks, his jaw is fixed. So the wearer's chin fits into the space where Smokey's mouth and tongue would otherwise be. I got into the Smokey suit with the help of a coworker at the ranger station. Then with difficulty, I got into the front of a pickup truck and we drove to this preschool located in the local community center. I sat in the front seat of the truck, fully dressed, facing south, in the sun, in 90-degree heat. My driver went out to the school to check that the kids were ready for Smokey. I waited and began to sweat. After what seemed like an hour, my helper reappeared and said it'd be another 20 minutes before Smokey could enter the classroom. I sweat some more. I've always sweated a lot. Many people have remarked on the amount of my sweating. Sitting in the truck, I could feel sweat running all down my face, especially from my scalp and head, where it ran down, dripped off my chin, and collected on Smokey's plastic tongue. Finally, the helper came back, got me out of the truck, and led me up the stairs and down the hall to the classroom. Upon entering the classroom, the teacher said, "Look, children, it's Smokey the Bear." Shuffling into the classroom, Smokey was instantly mobbed by 15 or so 5-year-olds. And since I had such limited vision and swarms of 3-foot-tall screaming children were headed for my groin just under my vision, I did the obvious. I looked down. Whereupon I douched at least 3 or 4 of the little tykes with a cup or 2 of bear drool, aka my sweat, which had been collecting on Smokey's tongue. The most wet of the bunch started screaming, which set up a chain reaction, and soon the entire class was screaming, crying, and trying to escape the salivating bear, who of course was about to start devouring small children. Many parents had been on hand to assist in the classroom and be there when Smokey arrived. Now those parents all sought out their wailing children. A near melee ensued. In the excitement, Smokey dropped his shovel, a real one, which clattered to the floor, and then Smokey promptly tripped over it and fell into the pool of his own sweat. Now wet and floundering around on the floor, I finally wheezed my helper, "Get me the hell out of here." Smokey beat a hasty retreat as the helper got him off the floor and quickly guided him out of the classroom. There wasn't much in the way of fire prevention messaging done that day. Those kids didn't get to hear, "Only you can prevent forest fires." Strangely, I was never asked to play Smokey again. And I just hope that the population of 40-year-olds in the valley today has gotten over their bear phobia and that they have a reasonably healthy relationship with fire. The end.
Now here's another story of Jim's about an airplane.
My first airplane trip. During a hot Oklahoma summer, this would have been about 1959, my family and I took an airplane trip to Ohio from Oklahoma. And I'm not sure now why we went by air, but my father took us to the airport and put four of us on a plane while he stayed behind. He was due to drive to Ohio a couple weeks later and spend some time with us and our grandparents before driving us all home. I was so excited I could hardly contain myself. A plane ride all the way to Ohio. And we'd get to see both sets of grandparents on the other end of the trip. I couldn't wait. On the morning of the flight, it must have been from Tulsa or maybe even Kansas City, we went to the airport. In those pre-security conscious days, of course, everyone could get fairly close to the airplanes. And so my mother, my father, and brother and sister and I all trooped up of the terminal onto the ramp and stood looking at the plane. What a marvel it was, shiny and powerful looking. Thinking back, I suppose it must have been an Electra or a Convair, maybe a DC-6 or 7. It was big and shiny. Back when travel used to be an event and before flying became the equivalent of a smelly bus trip through every city you've ever visited, people actually dressed up to get on an airplane. Flying was kind of a big deal, and people wore clothes at least as nice as what they wore to church. I probably had a nice shirt and dress slacks and maybe even a little tie for this flight. My sister and certainly my mother both had dresses on. My poor mom would have had her hands full with my little brother and sister. Aged 1.5 or so, my brother was in her arms. My sister would have been about 5, and my mother had her by the hand, I'm sure. I was about 8, and being the oldest and most mature, I was on my own. This is error number 1. We said our goodbyes to our dad and walked across the tarmac to the plane, still waving. Climbing the stairs, I continued waving madly at my dad. We turned around at the top of the steps before entering the plane and waved again, one last time. I entered the plane in awe. I was finally inside an airplane and about to be borne into the sky. I quickly looked at the layout and all the doodads and raced ahead to our assigned seats. My mother struggled along behind me, her hands full with 2 small kids. Arriving at our seats on the terminal side of the plane, I looked out the windows, saw Dad, and started waving again. I waved madly with vigor and excitement. Then I looked at the window more closely. It had handles on both sides. So I grabbed the handles and turned in order to open the window and wave some more. The window opened and fell outward, falling about 15 feet to the pavement with a loud crash. I saw my dad, stuck my head, neck, and shoulders out of the plane and kept waving. Began yelling, "Bye, Dad, bye!" Years later, my father told me he instantly realized what had happened even before hearing me. And as soon as the emergency door hit the ground, he realized who was responsible. He said he quit waving, took a step backwards, and tried to melt into the sparse crowd. After the window hit the deck, the pilot came back and began yelling at my mother. The flight was delayed, of course, while several mechanics fit the door back into the side of the plane. Much to my dismay, I was required to sit in an aisle seat for the whole flight. The pilot made it clear to my mother that I was not to be allowed anywhere near the window. I couldn't understand why, and I pouted the rest of the trip. I missed sitting next to that window. I'd planned the whole trip around that. Why in the world was the pilot, my mother, and most of the passengers mad at me? If that window wasn't supposed to open, why did it have handles and opening instructions printed in large letters right on it? Surprisingly, I get through airports pretty much trouble-free these days. I can only imagine what sort of no-fly list nightmare would follow a kid around for the rest of their life if they pulled a similar stunt today.
Well said, Jim. Things have changed a lot since 1959, huh? And while these Zoom calls are better than nothing for right now, I know we're all looking forward to a time when we can go to the Methow Library and hear my stories once again. Here's a little plug for that.
I would put a plug in for my story that Dawn at the Twist Library has so graciously hosted for several years now. And I think there's been at least half a dozen of them, maybe more. I think I've read 3 of them. And others have too. I know Tawny's read there and Jane Hill has, and certainly Diana and Bill have. So they're a lot of fun. And I think there's a lot of value in sharing stories, particularly at a small community like this. And I've talked with Diana in particular about different ways we might think about capturing and preserving some of these. I'm happy that Byron is recording this, and maybe that'll be a start of things to come. But I would encourage anybody who has a story to share to contact Dawn at the library and have her get you on the next My Story.
You've been listening to Voices of the Methow, an off-the-wall production. Until next time, thanks for listening.